On the topic of today, and talking about weather and warmth and cold, we are having a fireside chat. And I think the orange flowers are supposed to represent the flames of a cozy chimney place next to Drago and Mark. The topic today, in many ways, is self-explanatory when you look at who's sitting on stage. Getting collective action more recognized as a norm, as I was saying yesterday, has been one of the things we've focused on very, very much in the last couple of years. And truth be told, thank God I wasn't involved, because it means attending numerous international meetings, drafting sentence after sentence, changing comma, negotiating a word, reading more paper, negotiating more paper, and in the end, the result is a sentence or two. And we are incredibly proud of these sentences and two, because we all know that a sentence or two in the right piece of paper means a lot. But what goes into it is years of tedious and often very boring work. And but the impact is there. And nobody could talk about many meetings that were often, I imagine, a little bit tedious, reading a lot of paper, negotiating commas and half sentences, than our two speakers or panelists this morning, who I have the great pleasure of introducing. And I will start with Mark, because that's a little bit easier, because I spoke so much about Mark yesterday, and knowing that I don't think there's anyone new joining today, I don't think I need to say all that much about you, Mark, anymore, other than to say that you're obviously here for many reasons, but on this particular panel for your role as the chairman of the OECD Working Group on Bribery for a proud 24 years. And with the gentleman and my dear friend who sits next to you, Drago Kos, we have a combined 32 years of OECD convention history on this panel, which is quite impressive, because that is the entire lifetime of the convention, of course. Drago has only arrived last night at 2 in the morning, so I'm very grateful you made it to the conference. For many of you, he also needs no introduction, but I still want to point out some of the things that are perhaps less known about him. Drago started in the police, which is actually a background that I always found incredibly useful in our world. He's been the commissioner of the Anti-Corruption Commission in Slovenia. He was something very interesting, the international commissioner and the chair of the Joint Independent Anti-Corruption Monitoring and Evaluation Committee in Afghanistan. So that very much on the ground kind of work combined with the international work, which he has, of course, done at the OECD, and also as the chair of the Council of Europe's Greco monitoring mechanism, which he also chaired for 8 years. And last but not least, of course, as you know, chairing the OECD anti-bribery working group since 2014. So it's really a huge honor to have the two of you on our stage here, and I shall say no more and hand it over to you. Thank you so much, both of you.
Well, thank you very much, Greta, for this introduction. I think it's a fantastic moment to sit here, the two of us, and I'm very happy that you could make it, Drago. Now, the event has a strange name. It's called Fireside Chat. Now, I think we would like to do anything else but sit by a fire at the moment. We will need some fire later in the year, I suspect. But anyway, let's leave it as it stands here. We're supposed to talk about setting international standards on collective action, and I would really like to welcome you from my side, Drago, to this introductory half an hour that we have this morning. As you realize, we have one thing in common. We've been both, for a substantial part of our life, part of this movement against corruption, chairing the OECD Working Group on Bribery. And we have both seen through at least one of these council recommendations. And here I need to say a few words about the mechanics, the mechanisms that the OECD uses in regulation. The OECD Working Group on Bribery, very early already, and it's, I mean, we started working in 1989. People probably don't realize that. There was a first recommendation in 94. That was just to get us going, basically, and the recommendation is pretty empty. It was what we called a shopping list of items that we would like to revisit. The only essential bit of it was that it had a mechanism to keep us talking, and that was the crucial bit. It was also the basis of monitoring, something that came in much later. This early recommendation was upgraded in 1997. And originally, we, like the Financial Action Task Force on Money Laundering, thought we would not ever go into convention. We thought, well, recommendation is fine. It's politically binding. It's much more subtle, quicker, easier. But then quite a few countries said, no, criminal law, there you need a convention, you need binding law. And then it got relatively difficult, actually, in that year, 97, to move partly from a recommendation to a convention. But what was not criminal law was kept in a document that people forgot pretty much. That was this 1997 recommendation. So at that point, you had criminal law in a binding instrument and non-criminal law in a recommendation. But time went on, and we realized very quickly we were quite good in monitoring, actually developing practice, but we were no good at all in transforming that practice into new convention language. People just wouldn't allow us to do that anymore. It was very clear. And the reason was that in monitoring practice, the rule was unanimity -1. So the country could speak, that was examined, but they couldn't oppose. And of course, once you had the entirety of all the rules that we had developed in practice before us, then they could, of course, oppose. They could say stop, and then everybody opposed. And so what we then did is we said, well, instead of doing an additional protocol that would be the legal instrument of choice, we then said, okay, let's sort of use that recommendation and beef it up a bit. And then in 2009, 2010, we did a new recommendation, which is kind of hybrid. It does have criminal law elements in it. And I'm nearly at the point to ask Drago what he did with it, but I was digging in my bookshelf yesterday and found this is not the recommendation 2010, but it's a booklet on what the meaning is of an additional, of an annex to it called the OECD Good Practice Guidance 2010. And at the time in 2010, that was the place where, a bit hidden, we did have collective action mentioned. But there was much more to come. I think you did quite a lot on collective action. If I look at your 2021 recommendation, you have at least 4 places in the actual recommendation, plus in this annex where you do actually mention collective action. And the big question is, well, the OECD speaks to member states, so to states. And collective action, we've seen yesterday, is primarily, of course, amongst companies. There are certain circumstances under which also states are involved, public-private partnerships and so on. But you are now heavily leaning on member states to actually introduce or foster, there are different ways of you saying it, collective action. And maybe as an opening question to you, Drago, well, what do you really expect from member states? And of course, expectations always mean when you start monitoring, how are you going to monitor what countries are doing on collective action? Maybe that as a starting question to you.
Good morning. Well, thank you. You see, the whole thing that we mentioned, collective action now in the text of the recommendations, basically is the consequence of one simple, let's say, change which happened in the group and broadly. And that is that, let's say, until 2014, the governments were taking the companies more or less as the bad guys. So they were saying, well, those are the ones who are engaged in international bribery. So why would we talk with them? Then slowly this has changed, and governments, I would say not all, but majority of governments in the group understood that companies can be the partner of governments in fighting international bribery. And that's why we also inserted, let's say, collective action in the main text of the recommendation. And I have to say there was basically, I can only remember one discussion in relation to collective action, and that was in relation to the paragraph which is saying that the government should foster, facilitate. We're just discussing how much burden we should put on the governments to be the ones starting the collective action. Said, well, it would still be too much if you say you have to do it, so we water it down a bit, and that was the only discussion. Otherwise, it was quite easy, which means the governments are, I would not say not maybe happy, but they do understand that they have to work with the private sector together. And since collective actions, let's say, is a form of this public-private partnership, which obviously worked in some countries, that was not a problem with that. So how we will monitor it? I have to say I was quite surprised. Let's say the recommendation was adopted in November 21. After 2 weeks, we had the evaluation of France. And there were some countries already asking, well, you have to evaluate France against the standards of the new recommendation. You can't do that because France was undergoing completely different procedure. So we now decided for a gradual approach, and we will start monitoring, say, the things which are easier for countries to implement, and then we'll deal with the rest. I guess, let's say, the phase 5, now we are in the phase 4, in the phase 5 will be then the full-fledged monitoring of the new recommendation. How to monitor what countries will do in the area of collective action? Now there's the more stronger requirement for the countries is to engage with, let's say, through collective action when they are dealing with the demand side. So for sure there we will be asking quite straightforward questions. Otherwise, we will, of course, ask questions and wait for the governments to tell us how they work together with the private sector. What is important for us is to see that really governments did understand that they have to work together. And at the beginning, we will not be, well, I speak in the name of my successor because I'm leaving in December, as you know. But I guess the forms of cooperation between the private and public sector, at the beginning, the group will not be too strict and rigid on it. But this will change through time, for sure.
In a way, I mean, this raises a question which probably is quite new. You, by nature, with your instruments, have to talk to member states, to states. There are such instruments that actually address the private sector directly. I'm just thinking of the UN instrument that came out of the Ruggie principles, where one says, these are the expectations we would have vis-à-vis the private sector directly. And I mean, it wouldn't be totally totally impossible if the OECD Working Group on Bribery would say, well, we also have a list of desiderata for companies. That's what we would like to see. Obviously, it's a bit difficult. We can't directly monitor, but these are our expectations. I'm saying this because, of course, companies and organization of companies, business organizations are part of the monitoring process. They're allowed to speak, they give their opinion. So that could be an entry port, but maybe this is totally out of...
I guess we would, well, the group would have some problems with that. Not the group as such, you know, but let's say governments, for sure, countries, for sure, they would like to keep the control of interaction between the group and the companies. The second thing, I don't know how much companies would like us to see being directly monitored by us, you know. This is quite, as you know, it's quite a heavy exercise. You know, it's one thing if you participate in discussions with our lead examiners, and it's the other thing when you're directly examined by the lead examiners, and we are not, let's say, just like that called by TI as the gold standard of monitoring because we are tough. Our lead examiners are really tough, and I have to say that even in cases where so you would expect that because of the size of the country, of the political importance of the country, examiners will back off. It never happened. And we just had a case, let's say, the last time, 3 weeks ago, this is a situation which often happens. Let's say the country was criticizing the lead examiners, saying that they didn't do their job. They needed a lot of time and energy, you know, to calm down both sides and not let it to explode. So I guess this will be a very, let's say, slow process if it will ever happen there, because of the governments, but also because of the companies.
I mean, if we go back for a moment to what the OECD stands for, I think in the title of our chat here, it says setting international standards on collective action. So basically, I think the organizers have been aiming at what we are good at, or what you are good at. In the OECD, that is setting standards for the public sector and indirectly then, of course, for the individual countries in their own constituencies. And above all, the expectation that the OECD can see to it that it's implemented. Those standards are implemented. And that is, of course, a big step ahead of what we've been discussing yesterday. We've been discussing the phenomenology of and the history of collective action and where we stand today. But what we haven't so far discussed really is, should there be an institution that says, this is the standard, this is what collective action is all about, and by the way, we are going to see to it that this is implemented, that you're using it. I don't know if that is a route that you would go down.
Absolutely. No, once when we said it in the main text of the recommendation, that means we will, I will not say we will go after the countries, but we will, of course, we will explore and examine what the countries are doing. And of course, that then indirectly translates into also what companies are doing. So the annex to the good practice guidance is basically it's the, let's say, the toolbox for companies to do, let's say, their compliance systems, to do many other things. And although it's never said it's mandatory, this is the standard according to which we will be assessing the countries and indirectly the companies too. And the same goes for the collective action.
Very good. Now, it wasn't officially foreseen that we do open to for the discussion, but I think it would be, if we can do this technically, would be actually make sense if you have comments or questions from your side, then we'll see if we can activate the microphone. Yes, super, thank you. We have a request for the floor here.
Well, thank you, and good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for this very interesting.
It's not working, I'm sorry. We have to wait a second for the colleague up there who is at the control booth. You could also take maybe.
I can speak.
Yeah, it's. Yeah, I must apologize. It's my fault because it wasn't foreseen, but I think
No problem.
Interaction is always good.
No problem. Thank you very much. I start again. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for this very interesting discussion on a topic that is, really interesting to follow. I have two questions, and they connect to is this idea of the expectation from the private sector. And because the way I understand it, and I speak under your correction, because I'm not fully conversant with the process yet, and during the peer review process of the OECD, when you are assessing member countries' performance on specific investigation, in many cases, an investigation involve already private sector companies. So in a manner of speaking, would it not be right to say that the private sector in the OECD already has some understanding of the level of expectation that there is on them? So my question is this: when you do this peer review, do you invite, when you're considering specific cases, do you invite a representative from the private sector, and are they involved? Because I'm using the example of the FATF peer review process, where when the FATF evaluation process unfolds, especially for countries that happen to find themselves on their ICRG list, what is known as black or gray list, and they do meet with the private sector during the whole process. So there is already the beginning of, some understanding of the level of expectation from the private sector, and they understand this well as far as I, understand it to go. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, say concerning the expectations, what we have now in the recommendation, it's a very clear guidance for the companies what they have to have, not only in the annex but also in the main text. Let's say we have inserted four say, conditions which can get company off the hook when it faces the investigation. So the standards are there. Concerning our procedures, no, we always insist on having representatives of private sector in our meetings. The problem is that it is always the government which is organizing the meeting. So they can decide if they will invite someone. Well, we can still insist, of course, but they can also decide whom they will invite. So this is not so much, let's say, a big problem when you speak about private sector. It's a completely different story when it comes to the civil society. Some governments don't want to even hear about it, but for private sector, they do understand that it's good to have representatives there. And this is what usually happens too.
Now we have time for two more comments or questions. Nicola, please. And the two Nicolas.
Good morning. Thank you for the presentation. I've been involved with OECD with the working group and also in collective action. Now, I must say I find it a bit extraordinary that governments would now recommend for the private sector to engage in collective action. Because at the end, what you want is that companies don't engage in corruption. So how would you direct collective action to private sector when they act with integrity? And also, how do you then ensure that they don't involve in bid rigging or other competitive problems? It may be a good tool. I even think it is a good tool. But for governments to step in there, other than giving just guidance, I don't see how that can happen. Sorry.
Well, that was exactly let's say, the bulk of discussion we had when we were discussing collective action. So we said we should avoid the situation which you just described. The governments should not be the ones pushing private sector into collective action. But if there's an initiative coming from the private sector, the governments can do everything else. They can help, facilitate, assist in all possible manners. But governments cannot be the ones, let's say, pushing private sector into the collective action, at least not according to the recommendation. It can happen in practice, but legally, they're not obliged to do so.
If you allow me just to throw in a thought here, maybe an example. It says in item 4, the recommendation for or it's actually 12 subsection 4, consider fostering, facilitating, engaging, or participating in anti-bribery collective action. So it's very soft.
That was exactly the point where we spent so much time.
That I imagine. Now, I'm just thinking of an example. There is this Banknote Integrity Initiative, and they're actually quite tough. They're trying to root out corruption of anything that has to do with producing banknotes, acquiring jobs, then acquiring the job to do something, but also how to produce ink or how to produce paper and so on. There are people in the room who know much more about this because they are actually running it. But the essential point is the link to the public sector would be that you would ask central banks to only buy from accredited or certified producers if you want. There are these crossovers. Antti will probably be able to say much more about it. Nicola.
Yeah, hello, Nicola Bonucci, partner at Volo Hastings. Actually, picking up on your last point, Mark, I'm going to ask a question to you and all the participants. The governments now have agreed a recommendation, you have indicated. I think it would be extremely interesting to understand what the private sector expects from government in terms of collective action. And I would encourage this group, for example, to maybe brainstorm and come with a paper or with a statement or with something which is what is the expectation? What are the expectations of companies engaging in collective action vis-a-vis the government? What kind of guidance or recognition they would like to receive, respecting at the end of the day the role of the government and the role of the private sector. But I think I don't think you should wait for the guidance from the government. You should make clear what guidance you would like to receive.
I think that's a very helpful thought. There are naturally not only expectations of countries to vis-a-vis countries and countries to the private sector, but of course the private sector has its expectations in relation to the two countries if we want to implement this kind of language.
Well, I have to say, I'm not afraid here. What happened after the adoption of the recommendation is, let's say that the private sector, BIAC and IBA, International Bar Association, they engaged much more in, let's say, publicizing the fact that there is a new recommendation, discussing it and so on. So private sector is aware of it. I have to say, although it might not sound right, but say I have to criticize the OECD a bit because the OECD didn't do anything. We launched the recommendation, the Secretary General came, he gave 2.5 minutes speech, and that was it. The rest of the work was done by the IBA, BIAC, and so on. It's obvious that private sector is engaged. They do know what they got, and I'm sure there'll be quite a push also from the private sector. There will be differences from country to country, absolutely. But let's say I still expect that the major part of the group companies from the major part of the group will be the ones pushing their governments to engage.
Now we're nearly at the end of our half an hour, so we have one more request for the floor. Please.
Thank you very much indeed. My name is Olajobi Makewa. I'm from the UN Global Compact. I just want to respond to what Nicola just said in terms of what the private sector would like from governments. I think this is an area where the UN Global Compact can assist, actually, given the fact that we have so many local networks and we are doing a lot of policy dialogues between the private sector and government. So this is an area where we can actually, in one of our policy dialogues across the world, with our local networks, this is a subject matter we can actually take up. So
thank you very much.
It's good to know also for me where to go when we speak about the UN, because I just heard yesterday they said the UNODC is extremely unhappy with some parts of the recommendations. So we'll push UNODC on site and we'll discuss things with you.
Now, it would be the moment for you if you have a sort of a statement that sums up where you stand with the 2021 recommendation on collective action.
I'm sure there will be criticism too from the side of some, let's say, public or the governments that we gave too much emphasis, we put too much emphasis on the companies, then that we treat them too mildly. So I would say, let us work all together. We just try to find the proper balance. You know, it is absolutely clear, the governments cannot fight corruption by themselves. They need the private sector and civil society. Of course, this does mean now that we will automatically consider all the companies as good guys. And let's say, for the working group, I'm absolutely sure, because I know the composition, I know the guy sitting there, this will not be the case. They will not treat any other company any better than they did until now if the company will get engaged in any sort of international bribery. So it will be the business as usual. We'll go hard after the companies, but you also know in what kind of the world we live. It's also the, let's say, the appearance of the things. So what we did to recommendation is not we gave up on enforcement and prosecution and lean completely on prevention and engagement of private sector. No, we just wanted to establish the balance because we think we can work together. If not, I'm sure the pendulum will swing back in the years to come. I hope this will not happen, but we have to keep, let's say, clear mind now. It's not about turning colors from black to white or from white to black, but it is about working together. And I beg you, let us all do it together.
Thank you very much. Our time is up, and our job was to open the second day. And I think it is actually interesting that, that the OECD Working Group on Bribery has taken a major step by officially recognizing the existence of collective action. What remains open is what are the mutual or the respective expectations, what flows out of it, what does it really mean then in practice? That remains open. With this, thank you very much, Drago.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.